Testing 1, 2, 3. Big sigh. Hello. Welcome. This and that information, 12 August. We are starting over again because I messed up. I had a technical problem. Starting over with Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism, and the Politics of Nature, Chapter 7. Freedom beyond the free gift. Mechanization, the architect and futurist Buckminster Fuller wrote in Fortune in 1940, the harnessing of energy is man's answer to slavery. Fuller estimated that the world population, then approximately 2.1 billion, relied on an energy output equivalent to that expended by 37 billion human beings working 40 hours per week. The United States alone accounted for over half of this energy use. To denote the annual energy output of an average human man working 40 hours per week, Fuller introduced a new term, the energy slave. Fuller intended energy slaves to stand as the human equivalent of terms like horsepower. But his choice of terminology also evokes a social theory. Fossil fuels, it implies, have liberated human beings from forms of drudgery to which all previous societies were subjected. It intones, too, a warning about modern decadence. We all have servants silently toiling on our behalf without whom we could not survive. Fossil fuels, Fuller intimates, have allowed modern society to ignore an ancient problem, that life is a lot of work. 6 decades later, the journalist Andrew Nikiforuk would update Fuller's argument while making its underlying thesis more explicit in his book, The Energy of Slaves, footnote 2. The energy use of the average North American, Nikiforuk argues, is equivalent to the labor of 89 human beings. For Nikiforuk, this means that we all live like the slaveholders we now condemn, whether Roman patricians or Southern plantation owners. And for Nikiforuk, this is not a celebration of modern abundance, but a condemnation of modern life. The use of oil, he charges, has licensed frivolous consumption and thoughtless behavior. We're now so wholly dependent on an increasingly scarce resource that even if we could somehow muster the will to resume the burden of manual labor, we could not possibly substitute human energies for the work oil now performs. Now, this is not only a matter of scale. The density and portability of oil are simply irreplaceable. Human laborers could not power a plane, for example, or even an automobile. When the gift of coal and oil is depleted, he warns modern societies will be in trouble. Footnote 4. The objection to the terminology of energy slaves is obvious, that it utterly fails to capture the meaning of slavery. It simply doesn't make sense to refer to inanimate energy as a slave. Oil may be composed of biological material, but it matters that it isn't alive, and it matters that it isn't human. To be enslaved is to exist in a social relationship of domination, forced to labor, and even simply to live at someone else's command. By contrast, while we might be troubled by the way oil is obtained or the effects of its use, it's not clear what, if anything, is morally wrong with using this particular form of inanimate energy in itself. To compare the use of oil to the forced labor of human beings then seems not only offensive but oblivious. Yet if few today use the language of energy slaves, many contemporary anxieties about freedom are underpinned by an analysis that echoes Fuller's and Nikiforuk's The Mansion of Modern Freedoms. The historian Dipesh Chakrabarty argues in an influential essay, stands on an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel use. It is these cheap, intensive sources of energy that have made it possible for human beings to produce more food with less labor, move more widely and rapidly, and develop intellectual and artistic capacities that demand time and resources. For Chakrabarty, the expansion of freedom in the 20th century is in particular, the enfranchisement of women worldwide, decolonization and declarations of self-determination by newly independent nations, the expansion of human capacities and extension of human lives stands in troubling juxtaposition with the deterioration of our earthly home. The Anthropocene seems to many to definitively settle the debate on the side of the view that, as philosopher Pierre Charbonnier claims, nothing is more material than freedom. In a materially finite world, however, this appears a serious liability. The reliance of modern human life on such vast inputs from the non-human world and the revelation that those ostensibly free gifts come with serious material costs prompts an unsettling question. What happens if we stop treating nature as a free gift? As Chakrabarty asks, is the Anthropocene a critique of the narratives of freedom? Footnote 8. The archetypical modern narrative of freedom is a progressive one. a story of greater human freedom and flourishing, enabled by the steady pace of human reason, which has gradually subjugated nature to our command and liberated human beings from its capricious and uncaring grip. Although within critical scholarship, this is more than often encountered as a foil than a genuinely held article of faith, it is probably still the dominant ideology of modern freedom in the West and in much of the rest of the world, too. What is striking, then, is its reappearance, and even in critical theory, in a moment of apparent danger. To believe that modern freedoms are threatened, after all, one must believe that they have, at least to some degree, been achieved. There is, then, something ironic in Chakrabarty's troubled question. Freedom, which on the left has often appeared so elusive and unachievable, has been, in Chakrabarty's reckoning, too successful, too pervasive, too widely achieved. We were free, Chakrabarty suggests, at least some of us. Those of us in the industrialized capitalist West, or at least some of those, the white, the male, the owners of automobiles and suburban single-family homes equipped with washing machines. So maybe not that many of us after all. And not for very long. And yet it's too easy to simply wave away the concerns raised by Chakrabarty and others. They index a widely held fear that an ecologically sustainable society will be more austere and hence less free, that the freedom many of us enjoy is, as Elizabeth Anker suggests, an ugly one. Even those convinced that capitalism bears the lion's share of responsibility for the profligate use of nature's gifts might wonder whether the freedoms that have been advanced under capitalist modernity, however inadequate or partially realized, are possible without it. In this chapter, then, I want to face more directly the question that has shadowed the claims of this book. How might we live differently? What else might freedom mean? Capitalist unfreedom, Alyssa argues, consists in the structural force of class rule, as realized through domination in the workplace and the imposition of social costs, the offloading of reproductive labor, and the neglect of entire species. It consists, too, in the mute compulsion of value, the ways that our individual actions are challenged and directed by impersonal social structures, our alienation from our capacity for self-determination, what she's described as market rule. Capitalist unfreedom consists in the ways that our judgments of the world and the decisions we are able to make about it are funneled through a narrow set of evaluations that constrain the possibilities available to us. By compelling us to treat nature as a free gift, capitalism limits our ability to act on our judgments about what would constitute appropriate, respectful, or reciprocal relationships to non-human nature, about how we ought to value other kinds of things and how we might live differently as a result. To resist bad faith, I've argued, is to recognize the way that capitalism compels us to treat the more than human world. It is not the only way that we could, and so too that freedom itself is not inherently tragic, as some ecological thinkers imply. To the contrary, there's a good reason to think, as Sharon Cross argues, that an ecologically sustainable world would be a more emancipated one, footnote 11. But freedom doesn't come with guarantees. Freedom is not, as Linda Zerilli reminds us, a means to an end, even the end of ecological sustainability, footnote 12. To close with an appeal to freedom, then, isn't to offer a solution to ecological dilemmas or a balm to ecological anxiety. A non-capitalist world would not automatically remedy the problems this book has identified or resolve the dilemmas of making a living on a damaged planet. What it could do, simply, is to face these problems more directly. The recognition the recognition that human lives are fundamentally bound up not only with those of billions of other human beings, but also with those of countless non-humans, both living and not, means that our decisions about how to organize ourselves as human beings will inevitably also be decisions about how to organize the non-human world. They will always, in other words, be potentially political matters concerned with the organization of collective life and therefore perpetually open to contestation rather than permanently settled. This concluding chapter, then, doesn't offer a vision of what a post-capitalist world might look like, so much as a set of questions it might face. It considers how critics of capitalism have imagined freedom beyond it, and what we might take from those visions past as we attempt to chart our way in an uncertain future. Historically, two visions of freedom have been particularly powerful for capitalism's critics. One, a view of freedom as material, realized by transcending the realm of necessity. The other, a view of freedom as social, consisting in freedom from domination by others. The first is associated with classical Marxism from Karl Kautsky to G.A. Jerry Cohen, and more recently with visions of fully automated luxury communism. The second with critical theory and more recently radical republicanism. Each speaks to vital human aspirations, yet neither is fully adequate to our present. The material view makes freedom dependent on transcending nature in most cases, and more occasionally in submitting to it. The social view, by contrast, says little about nature at all, locating freedom in formal relationships between human beings who seem to float free of earthly concerns. A core argument of this book is that the material and the social must be understood in relation to each other as mutually mediated. This is what Simone de Beauvoir's concept of ambiguity recognizes, that social and material, form and content, can't be prized apart. Ambiguity, in turn, is a vital resource for thinking about the possibilities of social life in a rapidly changing material world. I draw on de Beauvoir's account of ambiguous freedom to chart a different path to the dilemma of necessity and freedom, and to foreground the ongoing task of socialist politics, not to offer a definite answer to the question of what nature is worth or how we should live together, but to continually reevaluate these questions in relation to one another. Footnote 13. Next section, material freedom, tragic freedom. The claim that nothing is more material than freedom has typically been made by the left. It is socialists who have argued that they will finally realize the universal freedom in practice that liberalism can guarantee only formally, and achieve the freedom from labor that capitalism promises but can never actually deliver. Within the Marxist and socialist tradition, this aspiration has often been expressed in terms of Marx's famous distinction, outlined ever so briefly in Volume 3 of Capital, between the realm of freedom and the realm of necessity. Quote, the realm of freedom actually begins only where labor, which is determined by necessity and mundane considerations, ceases. Thus, in the very nature of things that lies beyond the sphere of actual material production, freedom in this field can only consist in socialized man, the associated producers rationally regulating their interchange with nature, bringing it under their common control instead of being ruled by it as the blind forces of nature, and achieving this with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most favorable to and worthy of their human nature. But it nonetheless still remains a realm of necessity. Beyond it begins that development of human energy which is an end in itself, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can blossom forth only with this realm of necessity as its basis. The shortening of the working day is its basic prerequisite. Close quote, footnote 14. This passage is one of the most famous in all of Marx's oeuvre. It has been widely embraced, even as its meaning is hotly disputed. Although it has seeming significance for ecological debates as suggested by its references to the metabolic interaction with nature and expenditure of energy, its precise valence is as contested as any other aspect of Marx's corpus. More instructive than parsing Marx's own meaning, then, is to consider how freedom and necessity have been taken up with respect to questions of nature, material abundance, and scarcity. Next section, freedom beyond necessity. One interpretation, perhaps the most common, focuses on freedom from necessary labor. Marx is clear that working less is the aim of socialist society, and on this most socialists will agree. The view of freedom from the difficulty of toil, from the struggle to wrest a living from nature, echoes an ancient one. Quote, if each tool could perform its task on command, Aristotle had argued, if shuttles were cloth by themselves, a master craftsman would not need assistants, and masters would not need slaves, close quote, footnote 16. Put bluntly, slavery would be inevitable as long as tools could not do their own work. Marx had castigated Aristotle for justifying slavery, but other socialist thinkers accepted his reasoning. The Czech-Austrian socialist Karl Kautsky, leading theorist of the Second International and perhaps the most influential interpreter of Marx in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, saw ancient Athens as the epitome of freedom beyond necessity, the only society of thinkers and artists devoted to science and art for their own sakes, close quote, and also as evidence that only modern industry could realize freedom for all. Until the era of machinery, he agreed, activity for its own sake was possible only by throwing upon others the burden of labor, by exploiting them. Capitalism made clear that machinery alone was insufficient for liberation. The advent of self-operating tools, where privately owned, had not freed most people from the need to work, but rather had emptied labor of its intellectual content and made the worker an appendage to the machine. But the socialist use of machinery, Kautsky thought, could enable freedom from labor for all and make time for the freedom of life, freedom for artistic and intellectual activity, freedom for the noblest enjoyment. Footnote 18. It could, in other words, universalize the freedom that in Athens had been limited to the few, while avoiding the evil of slavery that had poisoned it. Much of 20th century Western Marxist and socialist thought would follow suit, proclaiming that socialism would master nature in order to achieve freedom and justice among human beings. As the 20th century progressed and the era of mass consumption arose, however, this view of freedom from necessary labor has often blurred into a view of freedom from necessity as scarcity. Freedom, on this view, is not only an abundance of free time, it is not, in other words, the condition of pre-industrial leisure that Marshall Solons famously described as quote-unquote Stone Age economics, but also an abundance of material goods, footnote 19. The philosopher G.A. Cohen agreed with Kautsky that socialism would be able to reduce labor hours in a way that capitalism could not, while claiming that a radically reduced working day would require astronomically high levels of productive power, footnote 20. This is not because productive power is, strictly speaking, necessary to reduce work, but rather because, in Cohen's views, class society itself is derivative from the struggle to wrest a living from nature. In Cohen's reading, a Marxist theory of history holds that as long as scarcity persists, some people will force others to perform unpleasant but necessary labor in their stead. Quote, men would relate in connections of mastery and servitude until they were masters of the physical world, close quote, footnote 21. Capitalism's dominion over nature not only makes possible an abundance of goods or time in their own right, enabling hedonistic enjoyment or the expansion of human capacities, rather, material abundance is the basic condition for ending the domination of one person by another. As Cohen would come to argue in his later work, it was because he was so uncompromisingly pessimistic about the social consequences of anything else than limitless abundance that Marx needed to be so optimistic about the possibility of that abundance. The obvious problem with this view is that any limits to abundance will necessitate limits to freedom. Already in the late 1970s, Cohen had worried that the looming resource crisis cast doubt on the possibility that human labor could be replaced entirely and the realm of freedom expanded universally. Footnote 23. By the 1990s, his concern about the material limits to abundance would animate his embrace of egalitarian philosophy. Whereas it had previously been possible to believe that equality was both historically inevitable and morally right, enabled by an eventual superabundance he thought guaranteed by the Marxist philosophy of history, the prospect of perpetual scarcity required more explicit arguments for equality. Footnote 24. The anxiety that resource constraints will make freedom beyond necessity impossible has only intensified in the decades since. The geographer Matt Huber has more recently argued that Marx's view of freedom beyond necessity is a view of freedom based on material abundance and relief from the toil of labor, a freedom that has thus far been achieved through use of fossil fuels. Rather than retreating from the aspiration to freedom beyond necessity, Huber argues that a solar-powered eco-socialism could use the renewable energy of the sun to power collectively owned productive forces and achieve abundance for all. Footnote 26. Yet even this positive vision is motivated by precisely the same pessimistic, even fatalistic view that Cohen sees in Marx. Without abundant sources of non-human energy, Huber warns, making possible other forms of material abundance, forms of unfree labor, are doomed to return. The writer Lee Phillips puts it even more bluntly: energy is freedom, growth is freedom. The most extreme version of freedom as total abundance comes in Aaron Bastani's view of fully automated luxury communism, in which all necessary labor is performed by robots, and everyone enjoys the kinds of luxurious consumption presently restricted to the mega wealthy. Footnote 29. Necessity is here characterized not only by the persistence of necessary labor, nor even the scarcity of necessary goods, but by the persistence of scarcity in any form. Freedom, similarly, consists not only in free time, but the expansion of luxury consumption in particular. While previous attempts to realize communism were thwarted by inadequate technological development, Bastani argues, the advent of information technologies means that the end of scarcity is finally possible. Yet the prospect of limited resources tinges even this utopian futurism with an undercurrent of desperation, persistent scarcity. Bastani worries. Persistent scarcity, Bastani worries, will lead to persistent conflict. It is imperative that a socialist society find new sources of nature's gifts, gleaned from mineral-rich asteroids, perhaps, or else full automation of labor will be impossible, and the realm of freedom will remain forever out of reach. Bastani's seemingly extravagant optimism, in other words, is necessitated by a fundamentally pessimistic view of the prospects for freedom in a world of anything less than truly limitless material abundance. As these examples illustrate, the idea that freedom is material is not necessarily an ecologically sanguine one. To the contrary, it's often seemed to position freedom as zero-sum, achieved only at someone or something else's expense. The eco-socialist Murray Mellor calls freedom beyond necessity a parasitical transcendence premised on shifting the burden of necessity onto others. Footnote 31. The implication is that a society that no longer avails itself of nature's free gifts will be doomed to more time-consuming and arduous labor, and the development of fewer capacities by fewer people. Perhaps worst of all, it predicts that such a society will revert to forms of hierarchy and overt unfreedom in which the many labors that the few can contemplate. This is precisely the fear underpinning many ecological anxieties about freedom. As Chakrabarty states outright, we do not need massive slave or forced labor to build the monuments of modern societies because energy is cheap. Footnote 32. Indeed, the liberation of women is often so attributed to washing machines and refrigerators conceived as a side effect of industrialization that it can come to seem a threat. These accounts suggest that the universalist aspirations of modernity, however disingenuous, partial, or exclusionary, account to little more than fossil-fueled fantasies. The past 2 centuries have constituted an extraordinary exception from the norm of human life, but we will eventually revert to the violent and unfree norm, a Hobbesian world of conflict, or an Aristotelian world of hierarchy where the freedom of some comes at the expense of that of others. Footnote 34. A third view is more pessimistic still, insisting that even total abundance would, in the words of the Italian Marxist Sebastian Timonaro, fail to free man from his biological limits. Footnote 35. Here, necessity is not the persistence of necessary labor or even scarcity, but is equated with nature itself, what Timonaro calls the autonomous and invincible reality of the material world that inevitably exceeds human control or social control. Footnote 36. For Timonaro, recognizing this physical reality, a materialism he claims Marxists have typically neglected, gives rise to a materialist pessimism, insofar as the realm of freedom can never be truly free of the necessity of illness, decay, and ultimately death. Timonaro's view is strikingly echoed by that of the radical feminist Shulamith Firestone, his contemporary, whose dialectic of sex similarly challenged Marxism's neglect of the physicality of the body, for Firestone, too, the most material base of all. Footnote 36. The sexual division of labor, Firestone argued, made women the slave class that maintained the species in order to free the other half. Aristotle's argument applied to gender. Footnote 39. While Firestone is associated with the revolutionary optimism of her proclamation that scientific advances had made possible the transcendence of nature and abolition of sex class, it, too, is underpinned by materialist pessimism rooted in her conviction that only technology could end women's oppression. Firestone must be a technological liberationist, in other words, because she is a biological determinist, one who believes that freedom is impossible as long as sexual difference persists. Nature itself sets the limit of freedom, and so nature itself must be mastered. If ecogenesis isn't around the corner, then neither is liberation. What is striking in the remarkable lack of faith in freedom that these views betray, they rest on a view of human beings as not only constrained but determined by nature, responding to material scarcity in predictable, even mechanical ways, enslaving or coercing others in order to escape harsh labor, struggling to maximize their share of social surplus, whatever the cost to others. Freedom here is an elusive prize, possible only under a strict set of material conditions, and perhaps not even then. It is contingent on total control of nature and vulnerable to chance events, a change in the climate that reduces agricultural productivity or a paucity of mineral-bearing asteroids. Freedom, paradoxically, appears largely out of our hands. If this determinism paints a grim picture of human life in the face of material finitude, it also lets human societies off the hook by suggesting that under certain conditions, domination is simply unavoidable. This view, it seems to me, crucial to resist, not least because it suggests that a future on a hotter and more volatile planet not only might, but must be a bleak one. Because necessity is persistent, it claims freedom must be tragic. Next section, freedom within necessity. If freedom can be curtailed by the basic fact of ongoing contingency, by the fact that human beings are mortal with unceasing material needs, living in a finite world, then perhaps this kind of freedom is simply not possible at all. Perhaps feminist and ecological thinkers in particular have argued there is something wrong with this vision of freedom altogether. Against it, many have offered an alternative, the realization of freedom within necessity. Footnote 40. As ecofeminists Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva argue, quote, define freedom does not involve subjugating or transcending the realm of necessity, but rather focusing on developing a vision of freedom, happiness, the good life within the limits of necessity, of nature. Close quote. While freedom from necessity can only ever be partial, quote, freedom within the realm of necessity can be universalized to all. Footnote 41. This is, at first glance, an appealing prospect. The critique of freedom beyond necessity has obvious force. The idea of transcending the material world altogether is fantastical, and the idea that freedom requires total material abundance seems to render its pursuit futile. Yet upon closer look, accounts of freedom within necessity, too, often amount to endorsements of unmediated relationships to a romanticized nature, often achieved only through certain kinds of labor. The limitation of this view is most evident in Mises' account of a feminist concept of labor as one that rejects, quote, the Marxist view that self-realization, human happiness, freedom, autonomy, the realm of freedom can be achieved only outside the sphere of necessity and of necessary labor. Footnote 42. Labor engaged in the direct production of life or of use values, Mises argues in particular, the work of mothers and peasants and subsistence producers is always both necessary and free. Footnote 43. More broadly, she claims, a feminist concept of labor entails, quote, a direct and sensual interaction with nature, with organic matter and living organisms. Footnote 44. This celebration of a direct interaction with nature, already present in Mises' early housewifization theory, would become increasingly significant as she developed a more explicitly ecofeminist position. So, too, would a critique of technology as inherently alienating, reflecting a hubristic attempt to escape from nature instead of demonstrating humility and respect for human limits. Reproductive technology, in particular in Mises' view, is a force for domination rather than liberation, a form of vivisection by the techno-patriarchs, footnote 46. Against it, she celebrates a vision of organic holism. To conceive and gestate a child without reproductive technology, she claims, is to experience the natural creativity of the body and the wild within oneself, to restore the living power destroyed by modern science. Footnote 47. Rather than freedom realized within necessity, then, this is a view of necessity as freedom. Instead of seeing the body as an inevitable limit on freedom, as Timpanaro and Firestone do, Mises insists that it is freedom's source, but only if its given constraints are accepted as necessary limits. She similarly collapses the distinction between the content of labor and its form of organization, equating labor that directly produces life with labor performed with some measure of autonomy. It is not a coincidence, as Mises herself notes, that the forms of sensuous labor that she identifies as both necessary and free are those that have largely escaped real subsumption, even within capitalist societies. They may be exhausting, boring, or unpleasant, but they are mostly organized by workers themselves, even if not entirely under conditions of their own choosing. It is this, rather than the fact of their connection to life per se, that makes it possible for them to be both burden and pleasure, that allows a degree of freedom within necessity. Now, this view is not, in fact, so far from Marx's own, insofar as it recognizes that the labor required to sustain life can be organized more or less freely, and closer still to Marx's embrace in earlier work of unalienated labor as a means to human development. Yet Mises' antipathy to any form of mediation or transformation threatens to equate the given with the necessary. Doing so evinces a remarkable disinterest in necessity itself, in understanding the material conditions of the world as they actually are, while also considering how they might be, and thus in contemplating what we might become other than what we are. Footnote 48. When necessity is equated with nature, however, freedom within necessity becomes a truism. It isn't actually possible to defy the necessity of the physical world, after all, or to overcome genuine natural limits. Rather than transcending nature as necessity, the forms of scientific knowledge that Mises decries as domination simply alter our view of what necessity is and how we might act differently within it. Rather than seeing efforts to alter the physical world as efforts to transcend nature, then they might be better understood. They might better be understood in terms of what David James calls a removal of surplus practical necessity, the elimination of constraints which turn out not to be truly necessary at all, or what John Bellamy Foster calls freedom as necessity, in which the realm of human possibilities are expanded through knowledge of nature. Those who champion freedom beyond necessity suggest that human freedom is possible only under narrow circumstances of superabundance, perhaps only when we can mine asteroids. This view of freedom quickly becomes absurd, but so too does the declaration that freedom can be realized only within a thin band of relationships and activities deemed truly natural. That freedom means accepting the world as it's given rather than asking how it might be made. In both accounts, it's ultimately nature that determines the possibilities and meaning of freedom. On the one hand, a nature we must escape, and on the other, a nature we must embrace. Let me stop here because we'll finish the rest on Monday at we'll stop at page 218. Because we have another thing coming up in our scheduling, and let me go ahead and stop